to testify before that same grand jury. Hammond is now being held in the same prison facility as Manning. The Jeremy Hammond Support Committee said in a statement, quote, "The government's effort to try to compel Jeremy to testify is punitive and mean-spirited. Jeremy has spent nearly 10 years in prison because of his commitment to his firmly held beliefs. There is no way that he would ever testify before a grand jury. The government knew this when they gave..."
The princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, Maharaja Hari Singh, who was holding out for independence, accepted becoming part of India on condition that the state retain autonomy in all matters except defense, currency, and foreign affairs. UN resolutions calling for a plebiscite to determine the final status of the territory have been rejected by India, which claims that because Kashmiris have voted in national elections in India, and chaotic by the US press, and somehow unrelated to the rest of Western democracies. But the political drama playing out in Rome over the past few weeks is very much tied to the rest of Europe and even to the United States. Journalists Attilio Moro and Andrew Spanner will be joining us later from Milan to unravel it for us. And finally, Consortium News is back up again after 5 charges. Could they be bringing against Assange, or are they going after other members of WikiLeaks around him? Is that what this is about, you think?
Well, I don't claim to know. There is some interesting speculation, but the move was kind of murkily executed by the government. In fact, I've heard two, and as we look at the plea deal that Hammond took, he was very principled and did not implicate any other people in the activity, including the paid informant. So when you look at the profile of Jeremy Hammond, it seems, could Hammond give them that he hasn't already, that they don't already know? And that is a head scratcher as well, because he did transfer Stratfor information to WikiLeaks. And perhaps this is part of the government effort to paint Assange the way he has with Chelsea Manning. Imprisoning Jeremy Hammond is not much of a punishment. It appears that the judge could essentially pause the Stratfor sentence to impose the...
There is this loophole, the so-called rule of specialty, that the U.S. could have quietly asked Britain to waive, and then they could add more charges. But I tend to think Kevin may be right that they're going after socialists. I see Elizabeth shaking her head. So do you agree with me?
No, I do. I'm nodding my head because I completely agree. I think that...
Nodding your head.
Yeah, I think that it's very unlikely. I mean, in a practical...
Keltel issued a stunning ruling that apparently has not trickled down to the district there in Northern Virginia, because he very clearly dismissed the Democratic National Committee's lawsuit, which was alleging this conspiracy between the GRU and WikiLeaks. And he basically has dismissed the case with prejudice. Now, I recognize that the case against, that the grand jury is examining and the charges brought against Assange so far don't relate to 2016 and the allegations related to the Russian meddling in the 2016 campaign. But it is widely presumed that that's, the occasional objections of the corporate media in its editorial voices.
Joe, I think we can hear you right now. Go ahead.
I frankly don't think there are going to be any charges related to the 2016 election. I think that lawsuit that you cite shows that there was no crime committed, and it's just very troubling that the government continues to pursue this, let alone having charged them under the Espionage Act.
And let me just close by saying that we've heard no objections from elected officials. Most human rights groups and justice groups are generally silent about both Manning's continued...
The United Nations. Ambassador Lodi served twice as Pakistan's ambassador to the United States here in Washington, and once as Pakistan's envoy to the United Kingdom as well. She also served as the first female editor of a major newspaper anywhere in Asia. Ambassador Lodi joined us earlier from her country's mission to the UN in New York, and we're going to a history of the Kashmir issue leading up to what has happened in the last few weeks.
Well, I've never had to sum up such a complicated issue in a soundbite, but let me try. The issue of Jammu and Kashmir is an issue of the unfinished agenda of decolonization, because what it involves is a dispute area which will have broken promises, human rights violations, military occupation, or what we see today, a curfew that has lasted for over 32 days, with all of Jammu and Kashmir being turned into an armed cage, where people are not even allowed to come out of their homes. Jammu and Kashmir, whereas, as I said to you before, it is disputed territory, it is an international dispute.
So what India did, of course, was to remove Article 370, revoke Article 370 from the Constitution, which had given autonomy to Kashmir and is now annexing it, as you say. Some people compare
who have seen their liberty taken away from them in every possible way. So I think when we talk about the people of occupied Kashmir, we must remember this is about a people who are in deep distress, who have been held prisoners in their own land, who cannot pray, whose children cannot go to school.
It's been what it should be, you think, in your view?
11 UN Security Council resolutions on Kashmir, and they entail an obligation on the part of the UN to help hold a plebiscite in Kashmir so that the people there can decide on how they want to be governed and how they want to live. So if the UN doesn't speak out, which some UN officials have spoken out, the UN Secretary General has issued a statement expressing his concern and also saying that the matter must be resolved according to the UN Charter and according to the UN Security Council resolutions. But we need action. We don't just need words, we need action.
Well, what about the mediation by the Secretary?
India refuses to talk to Pakistan. India refuses to accept mediation, whether it is mediation offered by President Trump or it's offered by the UN Secretary General. And India refuses to abide by its human rights commitments that it upholds in various UN bodies. And of course, India above all to resolve this dispute, but it has to be in accordance with the wishes of the Kashmiri people and in accordance with the UN Security Council resolutions.
So you're pleased with the US position?
Well, we think the US should step up and do more. We think the US should call out on the human rights violations. Security Council resolutions clearly say that there can be no material change that can be brought about in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. And this is clearly an attempt to bring about a material change.
That leads me to my next question, which is that Pakistan's ministry said in a statement that as party to this international dispute, Pakistan will exercise all possible...
We're here for UNGA's high-level week, which is the General Assembly's high-level week. He will be speaking on this issue. He will be meeting with other world leaders. So we are going to continue to build political and diplomatic momentum to bear on India, and India then listens to the voice of the...
We'll let you go, Ambassador. We know you have another appointment, and it really was great of you to join us for these 20 minutes. And we hope that this crisis is resolved peacefully. So thank you again for joining us. That was Ambassador Malaya Lodi coming to us from the Pakistani mission to the United Nations on Wednesday to prevent a no-deal Brexit. And he called for a second bill to have a general election on October 15th. That was voted down in the first reading. We understand there'll be another one on Monday. That October 15th election date would be just days before the British Prime Minister, whoever it is to meet with EU officials. Johnson has for joining us.
Pleasure to be with you, Joe.
So now that this bill has passed, a no-deal Brexit is not possible. Where does this leave Johnson? And am I correct in my assessment that he's looking to get out without a deal with the EU so he can make one with Trump?
Absolutely correct in every particular. Johnson, and he received the permission of the Queen. Now think about how undemocratic that is. A Prime Minister who has not yet received a mandate from the British people as Prime Minister going to an unelected head of state to receive permission to suspend the elected parliament in order to drive through a possibility of the re-imposition of a hard border between the 6 counties in the north of Ireland that are controlled by the UK and the 26-county Irish Republic, which is a EU member state, again because of a change in customs arrangements. That could be a catalyst for a return to conflict in the north of Ireland. But Boris Johnson and his gang of hard Brexiteers. The man's a complete opportunist. And this, I think, Joe, has moved beyond Brexit or Remain. It's moved to the condition of whether you stand on the ground of the politics of socialism and solidarity with Jeremy Corbyn, or you stand on the ground of US vassalage and disaster capitalism with Boris Johnson and his hard Brexit. Scotland, Wales and England, and the colonised, in my view, 6 counties of the north of Ireland. In Scotland, 62% of people voted to remain. 55% of people in the north of Ireland voted to remain. So this Brexit vote was delivered by people in England and Wales. Jeremy Corbyn is putting the country first. We know that he is, by instinct, a Eurosceptic. So Corbyn is a man who has a manifesto that would address all these things. And I think after the 2017 election, with Theresa May, who had a parliamentary majority going in, she lost that majority because Corbyn's manifesto of wealth redistribution and an end to austerity lit everything up. And he is not a great performer at the dispatch. You know, Bill Clinton was right in one sense when he said it's the economy stupid. Ireland, the north of Ireland, has benefited enormously from EU membership because agricultural subsidies, it's a very highly agricultural economy in Ireland, and they've benefited from the subsidies that have flowed from the EU. So yes, there could be a move towards reunification, especially if the economy tanks in favour of Scottish independence. People have had enough in Scotland of being dragged of this Tory government. Tories are reviled in Scotland, but a sharp lens is now being shone on this country's passage for a constitution, because what has been exposed in these last weeks, where there is real, you know, this is a colonial relic of a state. The UK was forged in mercantilism, born in mercantilism in the interest of a rising colonial class. And it's no longer fit for purpose. It's underpinned by semi-feudal institutions, the monarchy, an unelected second chamber, the House of Lords, the Privy Council, an unelected West in all but name is dead. And it's only being life forced by these savage austerity programs. And the only thing needs to bury the corpse. That is what's causing these crises. And this crisis is obviously hitting the EU as well, which is a neoliberal EU. But my view is this is a case where the cure is worse than the disease.
It is on its own, and Wales probably would want to leave too. Would that weaken Britain's current influence, mostly malign, around the world? Would that be, in a sense, a positive thing?
Absolutely positive. It would be a benefit to mankind, given Britain's malign role in the world, which predates its membership of the EU by what? Isolated, I mean, trying to draw these...
Anti-immigration, that kind of thing, yeah.
But certainly, yeah, 800 bases in over 70 countries around the world. They're not there to make the world safe for democracy, as you know. They're there to make the world safe for the ability of Western, predominantly US corporations, to plunder the planet's natural and human resources. These would be the two most malign actors. But
that would be an interesting battle at the UN about whether England could take over a British seat with the veto.
Yes.
I mean, the Russian Federation was able to get it when the Soviet Union dissolved.
Yes.
But I wonder if England would survive or not. But you still think it would be even a truncated English army instead of a British army, but still with its...
is elected as Prime Minister. The reason they hate Jeremy Corbyn so much, the reason he's received such a drubbing of unprecedented levels, demonisation, real enemy of the people stuff in the right-wing Tory press, is not because of his domestic programme. They can live with that. It actually makes economic sense. Investing, reinvesting, reintroducing aggregate demand in the real economy and so on. It's on where I voted to remain in the EU, as I mentioned earlier, because I believe the cure is worse than the disease. It doesn't mean I'm a fulsome supporter of the EU. Jeremy Corbyn's official stance in that campaign as head of the Labour Party was remain and reform, try and reform the EU. The EU has much to answer for in terms of being responsible for this crisis. It's really, really important. So that's the two poles, Corbyn standing for a negotiated Brexit or a hard Brexit, a fundamentalist Brexit. The fundamentalist Brexit has been defeated in the Parliament after Johnson tried to railroad through a hard Brexit by suspending Parliament. And so the 31st October, beyond 31st of October, when by default of the British state are actually private schools. These elite educational institutions like Eton and Harrow and Fettes in Edinburgh, where I am, where Tony Blair's spent his formative educational years, Oxford and Cambridge universities. These people are imbued with this born-to-rule entitlement. They're inculcated with this hubris, this ruling class hubris. And Cameron in his hubris didn't understand the country. If the Nat vacuum's been filled by the forces of reaction rather than the forces of the left, which I am on, we see a manifestation of that with Donald Trump. And Brexit is the British manifestation of that. The right has been winning the battle of the ideas when it comes to explaining the ravages of austerity, i.e. it's not inequality, it's not 30 years of Thatcherism, it's not the banks, it's not the greed of the rich, it's not of its past, and move forward and understand its real place in the world, that we're not a major power and we shouldn't stop acting like one. We should act like a responsible country that advocates diplomacy and peace and stability. Britain is wedded to US foreign policy and has been for many, many years, since the end of the Second World War, and certainly hotbeds of extremism. These produce war criminal after war criminal. These are extremists in tailored suits. You know, these are our fundamentalist Islamic madrasas, these establishments, and actually they do more damage and they're even more dangerous given the crimes that have issued out of these establishments. And until we address our history and
that those populations who are so damaged by conservative politics nonetheless go the xenophobic route rather than pointing the finger at the actual source of their economic and other pain.
It's false consciousness, and that false consciousness is sown by a media that's controlled by a clutch of billionaires who are the real problem in our society. That's why alternative media is so important. Accusations of anti-Semitism, that he's somehow some communist spy, that he was when Czechoslovakia was a communist country, he was a spy for the Czechoslovakians in the 1970s, that he's some kind of monster, that he talks to terrorists, that he's a terrorist enabler and sympathizer and so on. They do more damage than 1,000 bayonets. It's regressive politics. The far right's been able to harness social media to its advantage as well. But I do think it comes down to mainstream mainstream political parties like Labour, like the Democrats, allowing space for radicals, or radicals able to open up space. You see this with the Squad, the so-called Squad, Ilhan Omar and Alexander Ocasio.
But I want to go down to the more mundane things about the deal.
Yeah.
Corbyn never really, in my view, from what I understand, never really tried to dodge the question whether he was Remain or Brexit. But now, if he were to become prime minister, let's say, and he had time till January 22nd, whatever the date would be, for another extension,
could come out under a Corbyn government. It is manifestly different. It's qualitatively different in terms of mass consciousness, because he's a socialist prime minister with a socialist programme coming out. It won't be anti-migrant. It'll be anti-corporations. It'll be anti-EU institutions. He'll maintain the rights of EU nationals who are currently living in the UK. It will be much not in the interest of corporations and banks, but in the interest of its peoples. And unless they wake up to that fact, then they deserve to go the way of all flesh. It deserves to be consigned to the dustbin of history. The key question is, can it be reformed? You've got Yellow Jackets protesters every weekend in France protesting, being battened down by French riot police. They've been there for like 42, 43.
And I think there was a sincerity then among some European leaders then not doing that. That is long gone. So we're between leave and remain with a horrible bureaucracy that is totally beholden to the banks, central banks and private banks.
Yes. And
leaving and creating chaos that we've seen.
So breaking that up and privatizing that cannot be allowed to happen. So Jacques Delors was sincere. You're absolutely right. But Margaret Thatcher and the onset of free market economics in the 1970s, the oil shocks in the early 70s, the liberalisation of credit and the rise of inflation, and that produced industrial action by workers whose wages were going down in value and so on and so on. That created all the industrial strife in the 2008. And this is a situation that has striking parallels in this regard with the 1930s. And we must learn from that period, or we are headed for perdition.
You mentioned before that Corbyn's victory would have a progressive impact on the continent. And, we saw in France, they resisted what comes in U.S. insurance companies. And we who live here in the U.S. are paying over I'm paying over $1,000 a month, $1,169 to be exact, for insurance. This is the kind of thing that Britons would be facing. However, if there's a rump England and Britain and Scotland.
Maybe constitutionally, the existing arrangement to produce that space for a shift in consciousness. It's all about ideology and consciousness for me. And, Scotland would not be burdened by a defence budget, a defence budget that's out of keeping with its needs, its real needs. If England tried to maintain a defence budget to try and keep its prestige on the world stages, we can't play politics. It's not a parlour game. People's jobs are at stake. People's lives are at stake. But yeah, the US Health Service, I've said it to friends over here and people I know, because I lived in the States for 7 years. I didn't have health insurance and I needed to get health care. And I have strong memories of standing outside a charity hospital at 7 in the morning trying to be one of the people who are fortunate enough to be selected, given whether an organised, properly constituted left can take advantage of these opportunities. It remains to be seen whether it can.
Well, John, I want to thank you, but I have one last question, which is, if there's a Prime Minister Corbyn and he gets a deal better than May's or the same, and he would he put that to the
can be satisfied that it is the settled will of the British people. But that's the only basis on which I think we could possibly gain credibility of being on the ballot, given the result of the first referendum in 2016.
Well, we were joined by John White from Edinburgh to talk about the extraordinary events happening in Westminster right now that really do put Giuseppe Conte named a new cabinet, which might be a short-term solution to what the New York Times called head-spinning political turmoil. This is in the vein of American coverage of Italian politics. Since I've been reading American papers, particularly the Times, about Italy, they take almost an Orientalist view towards Italy. Now, Italy is in the West. It's not an Oriental since the end of the Second World War. And to join us to answer those questions are two Consortium News contributors. They also write for other news organizations, and they both happen to be in Milano. Attilio Moro is based in Brussels. He covers the EU, so he'll be able to give us that perspective as well. He's an Italian, and I've known Attilio many years. We were colleagues at the UN in New York.
With these two relatively new parties, La Lega was already in the Berlusconi's government twice, even 3 times, I guess. But the movement Five Star was a completely new movement, not even a party, which for the first time, which during the election made a lot of promises. The problem with this party was that they had to get into the government with another party, La Lega, which was a completely different party, because the first one, the movement Five Star, was from the south, because after a little less than 1 year, they realized that they were incompatible, and it was not possible to keep on going with this day-per-day solution to huge problems of compatibility.
Thank you, Attilio. I want to bring Andrew in. Is it more
Five Star movement to the policies of the EU, the European Union, which are have generally been identified as responsible for the effects of globalization, so economic effects of globalization. And this government crisis is about getting rid of, although the League sort of did it on its own, in Europe, as in the United States, the election of Donald Trump, parties mostly on the right, but not only on the right, also on the left, to come into power, who are, or to get close to power in other countries, who are anti-establishment, anti-system. That's right. They say that we got to kick all the bums out. And that was what the Five Star movement, that was their big thing. We got to kick out all the corrupt politicians, popular support. So the change in government changes the situation completely in Italy, because you no longer will have a government that placed itself in opposition, wanting to fight with the EU. And now with the Democratic Party coming in, they're saying we're going to patch everything up and we're going to get back in line.
So there's also another element. It seems that both the League and the Five Star
following the League on this issue just for the sake of, staying in the government. But they were not xenophobic as much as the League. The problem was that, this xenophobic attitude has been working randomly very well. It was very, very effective in capturing this kind of mood, public mood. Against Europe, as my colleague was saying, the main adversary of Salvini was not Union. The European Union decided that you have to stick to the Maastricht Treaty. No, the government has to shut down, because so it's a kind of delicate
with Attilio on the debt issue.
The debt question is essential, as Attilio was saying. So you have to keep in mind that the Italian public debt, which is one of the highest in the world. It's 130% about of GDP. Mostly grew up during the 1980s, and it actually mostly grew. No more social state. It would mean nothing if you actually followed this. And the crazy thing is the Italian government for the past 25 years, almost every year, has had a primary budget surplus, meaning that they don't run a deficit except for this debt service. And the way that the financial system is set up now is the billions more euros, and they can't do anything. So it's a complete blackmail. And there's all sorts of problems. Italy's inefficient. It could do a lot better in a lot of areas, but it's also an industrial powerhouse. But this is the issue, that if you don't find a way, change the mechanisms.
If it's conceivable that Salvini wins the election, next election, whatever. Okay, yeah. No, I don't think so. There's a kind of, informal agreement among parties in Italy to isolate Salvini, at least as far as Salvini is there. Lega is no one political leader in Italy can get into the government. It happened with Berlusconi, which has been fired by Merkel, let's say, in 2012, I guess. Yeah, I remember. If I remember well, it happens other times, and against Europe cannot.
Because the Italian institutions and the European institutions don't want to vote, and they certainly don't want Salvini in government, as was being said. So now it's very likely this government will last for a while. And I think that Salvini made a big mistake. He was being pushed, I must say, currency. So there's no political debate, according to the institutions, the permanent institutions of this country, and the president is elected every 7 years, but he's supposed to defend the Constitution. According to him, there's no debate about the European Union. That's not allowed. Politics is how you deal with the crumbs, what's left, that something was brewing and something big was brewing. But it was basically ignored. And the idea is we're going to keep them out. We're going to keep these guys out of the institutions and go on basically the way we were before, although we'll change our rhetoric a little bit. And that didn't work. So things boiled over at a certain point. And, if anything, it doesn't solve the problem at all, especially if this government comes back in and says, well, yeah, we're going to follow the line. We're going to, try to manage it the way they did it in the past. We're going to try to manage it, get things a little bit better. The EU will probably help us out a little bit. The EU is going to help this government out a little bit. You're not Salvini, so we're going to give you a little more leeway. But they're not going to solve the old.
That's the debate. It's not in or out of the European Union. It's something that in Italy, no one, if you talk to the most fervent anti-European voter, no one can believe that it's possible for Italy to get out from there. While for the UK, it's not.
Center-left government now that the right wing that far-right party is out, and what would that be in terms of, what would that mean for policy, other policies beside the European Union, social policy, for example? Well, it's early to say, because you don't forget that the PD, which has been tabled this question, and to design a law which allowed them now to get 700 euros a month, which is not much, but better than nothing. During the tenure, when the PD was staying in the government, they never managed to conceive such a measure to help the poorest in the country. On the contrary, grow up and push for that, so that we have, again, a party that wants to bring a social democracy to Italy that has nationalizations. Or are we done with that? Is that absolutely impossible? I'm going to ask both Andrew and Attilio that.
Well, I think it's quite clear that in recent decades, gave this universal income. It's limited compared to what they wanted, but it's a start in giving people money back, people who are poor. The League, the right-wing party, aimed more at a middle-class vote, but they also insisted on raising pensions again for some people, and on lowering taxes for self-employed people. Right through. They totally jumped into it around Europe, saying we're much better for the people than the left is, the big left parties. And that's exactly what's happening. And that's the thing that people say here in Europe. The workers vote more for the League now than they do for the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has become a radical chic party. and everybody knows it.
But they're in the government now. Will they have any influence?
From Germany and France, from Macron. But the problem is, and this is a big thing, you mentioned before, Salvini said this is a government, born in Paris and Berlin. Well, it is. Italy has suffered greatly from French policy and German policy, set up for probably a fall in the midterm.
Attilio, I'm going to give you the last word. Is there any hope for the left, a real left, not this phony left that Andrew was describing in Italy?
I think it will take time. It will take time. The Partito Democratico, Democratic Party, no blue collars anymore. I mean, just a few maybe in the north, some northern provinces. The social makeup of the country has changed. So this culture went lost. What is still there is the old ancient habit to run the day per day is more difficult as you have the division in society which were inconceivable 20 years, 30 years, 40 years ago. People completely out of the society and also people who don't have a percentage of the vote.
So it's pretty extraordinary that there might be more, that socialism might be more popular in the United States when we look at the movement coalescing around Bernie Sanders than it is in Italy, where Giulio Andreotti would be in the Democratic Party, from what Attilio is saying.
Yeah.
Andreotti being, of course, the great desk at the Central Intelligence Agency to talk about another crisis, U.S.-Russian relations. For CN Live, I'm Joe Loria. See you next week.
Get out your notebook. There's more.